Good morning and welcome each and every one of you to the 9th Annual International Human Rights Research Conference of the University of Padova Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca. My name is Pietro de Perini. Most of you know me in a way or in the other. I'm a researcher in international politics, and I have been the coordinator of the international and interdisciplinary scientific committee that has given shape to the contents and the themes that will be discussed during these 2 days. I'm very glad again to give a warm welcome to all those here at the Archivio Antico, at the Palazzo del Bo, the historic headquarters of this ancient university, and to those online on Zoom. Indeed, due to the large appeal that this event created and to our aim to try to ease as much as possible a large participation in the debates which we are having, we have decided to provide dual access to his participation of both speakers and audience from many parts of Italy and the world. So, in the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, and as the COP30 is beginning later today in Belém do Pará, in Brazil, the country where the first summit of the Earth took place around 35 years old, we have decided to develop the discussion of this conference around deeper and deeper challenges to human and people's rights brought by an era of collapsing cooperation and faith in multilateral institutions, arguably the only or the main places or platform, if you wish, where a sincere, responsible, and even costly consensus among all stakeholders should be rebuilt if any insight to address, to reverse the current situation marked by rising aggressive nationalism, return of power politics, armed conflict, rearmament, and lack of regard from environmental consequences of this trend has to be found in an inclusive and just fashion. So both the plenary and the panels will try to tackle aspects of the consequences of such situation, such global situation on human and people's rights, and we'll hope they'll manage to combine raw in-depth criticism about the what, the how, and the why, with evidence of what is still working or even working better, being more effective than in the past, and insights to imagine a way out of this situation, reworking and reimagining, starting from the strengths and weaknesses of the broader human rights movement and its advocate. After these few words, I would like to introduce our first panel, who is mostly devoted to an introductory and institutional salutation, and I will start with Marco Mascia, who's professor of international relations, the chairholder of the Unesco Chair, Human Rights, Democracy and Peace, that our university has been holding since 1999, and of course the president of the University Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca. Professor Mascia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pietro. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear students, dear panelists. On behalf of the Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca, and the UNESCO Chair, Human Rights, Democracy and Peace of the University of Padova, I have the honor and the great pleasure to warmly welcome each of you to the International Conference from the right to self-determination to the right to peace, human people's rights in the collapsing multilateral order. I am especially grateful to the keynote speakers, Ms. Nazila Ghanea, Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. To Game Erdem Turkelly, Research Professor at the Law and Development Research Group of the University of Antwerp. Professor Ian Wouters, a full professor of international law and international organization and Jean Monnet Chair ad personam in European Union and global governance. And of course to Damien Short, of the Human Rights Consortium of the School of Advanced Studies, University of London. A special thanks to the institute that have cooperated in the organization and management of conferences and research panels, the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, the Human Rights Consortium School of Advanced Studies, University of London, the Unesco Chair in Human Rights and Human Security at the University of Graz, the Institute of International Studies at the University of Wrocław, the Center for Applied Human Rights, University of York, and the Global Campus of Human Rights. My deep gratitude to Pietro De Perini, Professor of Human Rights and International Politics, and to extraordinary staff of the Human Rights Center for the great work done to organize this conference. A warm welcome to the students of the Master Degree Program in Human Rights and Multilevel Governance and the International Ph.D. Program in Human Rights Society and Multilevel Governance. Let me add just a few words on the conference that is now inaugurating. We are gathered here today on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. The United Nations was created in the aftermath of the Second World War to save, I quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. The United Nations was placed at the center of a multilateral order tasked with maintaining international peace and security. Thanks to UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the international human rights law takes shape and develops, which in turn generates the universal, regional, and national machinery for the protection of human rights. The right to self-determination is part of human rights law. It has been formally recognized by UN Charter and for all peoples by identical Article 1 of the two international covenants of 1966. Professor Hector Grossespiel, one of the fathers of the two international covenants, wrote, "The right to self-determination has a permanent virtuality. This means that as long as there is a people, there is a right to self-determination." The fundamental principle of human rights savoir is their interdependence and indivisibility. Human rights are all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, individual and collective, of the person and of the peoples. The right to self-determination is therefore closely interconnected with the right to peace and with all other human rights. When the right to self-determination is violated, as in the case of the Palestinian peoples, all human rights are violated. The right of people to exist is also recognized by international human rights law. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, I quote, confirms that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. The Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, an instrument of international justice that finds its legal basis in the United Nations Charter and the International Human Rights Conventions, represent another significant step to defend the international rule of law. The responsibility to investigate and punish war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide is a legal obligation for states. Neither political reason nor reason of state can be invoked for not respecting this obligation. No one is above the law. Impunity is the most significant obstacle to justice and reparation for victims and survivors of human rights violations and war crimes and crimes against humanity. Impunity undermines trust in political institutions and the principle of the rule of law at the national and international levels. Today, the United Nations, the multilateral system, and international law are under attack. The human rights machinery is under attack. The judge of the International Criminal Court are under attack. The new special rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese are under attack. As United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, I quote, "An increasing number of governments feel entitled to trample on international law, violate the United Nations Charter, international human rights conventions, and decisions of international courts without anything happening." Without anything happening. The law of force is prevailing over the force of law. The alternative to the United Nations and the multilateral order is chaos, anarchy. The time has come to revive the spirit and letter of the United Nations Charter. The United Nations must once again become the global construction site for building peace in the world, guarantor of international legality, an institution of democratic global governance aimed at preventing conflict and promoting respect for the rights of individuals and peoples and human security. The United Nations we need is the United Nations of peoples who want to live together in peace and take care of our common heritage. A legitimate claim because it is based on the text of the preamble of the United Nations Charter, with the people of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from scourge of war. The United Nations path is the legal, institutional, and non-violent path to peace. Without institution, there are no rights, and without rights, there is no peace. And this applies at all levels of governance, from the city to the United Nations. But the goal of strengthening and democratizing the United Nations and the multilateral system must go hand in hand with another strategic goal, removing from state the monopoly on the right to peace, the jus ad pacem, as an attribute of sovereignty intertwined with the right to wage war, the jus ad bellum. History teaches us that the exercise of the former has always been subordinated to the realpolitik needs of the latter, si vis pacem para bellum. Recognizing peace as a fundamental right of the individual and the peoples means freeing peace from deadly embrace of armed sovereignty to enter the sphere of guaranteeing fundamental rights and freedom, whose roots lie in human security, human dignity, embodied in the supreme right to life. In other words, peace enters the sphere that is naturally its own, that of the original sovereignty of the holder of fundamental rights, the human person. Thank you, and good work to everyone, and enjoy your stay in Padova. Thank you. Pietro.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mascia. Our second speaker is Maria Cristina Ginevra, who is a professor on career guidance and human rights and inclusion at the Department of Psychology, Sociology, Education, and Applied Psychology here in Padova. But here today, she's with us as vice coordinator of our international Ph.D. program in human rights, society, and multi-level governance. Cristina, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Professor Marco Mascia, the president of the Human Rights Center Antonio Papisca, and Professor Pietro de Perini, the coordinator of the scientific committee of this international conference, for inviting me to represent the international joint PhD program in human rights, society, and multi-level governance. The topic of this international conference is really important in this social political context in which we are living in. that is characterized by new global challenges. We are observing a return of nationalism, growing geopolitical tension, a crisis in the global governance system, increasing violation of individuals' and people's rights, and a rise in military spending. In this historical period, we are experiencing a transition from welfare to warfare, which places war at the center of social life. This is a radical change that delayed the idea of personal and social well-being in its broadest and rightest sense, coupled with freedom, equality, and peace, imposes war as harbinger of destruction. In this context, it no longer seems enough to promote peace as a noble ideal or a vague political goal. There is need to move from the established right to self-determination to a more strong recognition of peace as a fundamental human right. Peace is not simply the absence of war, but an active condition of justice, equity, and mutual respect among peoples and nations, and in this sense, a condition for global stability, enjoyment for all other rights. In this perspective, research, and in particular interdisciplinary research and a multi-level approach, represent the key for building peaceful and inclusive communities based on social and environmental justice. In other words, research, and I believe in this, research is the key to guarantee the positive peace to which we aspire in this international conference. And this is where our international joint Ph.D. program in human rights, society, and multi-level governance plays a fundamental role. Human rights, the focus on human rights in our course is significant for building inclusive, just, and equitable societies, reducing social tensions, and preventing conflicts. It's really important to provide future researchers, future professionals and experts in this, from diverse educational backgrounds with a deep understanding of human rights protection systems essential for building peaceful society. Society, that is the second key word of the title of our program. The emphasis on the concept of society recognizes that peace is not just a matter of international relations, but is rooted in social dynamics at local and national levels. In this sense, it is really important to stimulate future researcher skills to analyze and address social challenges that can undermine peace, such as inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. And finally, the concept of multi-level governance in our PhD program is really important in our globalized world. Peace, in fact, requires cooperation and coordination between different levels of administration, from local to global. It is really important to prepare future researchers and experts to navigate this complex governance landscape, essential for addressing transnational challenges such as climate change, migration, and terrorism, which have a direct impact on world peace. So, in the last recent years, we have chosen to dedicate some PhD scholarship to this topic, such as peace and nonviolent conflict management, Civil Peace Corps as a new opportunity for promotion of international peace and security, and social transformation and security, peace building, and sustainable development in Africa. And the results, some results of this research project will be presented this afternoon and tomorrow in this international conference. So overall, our commitment to peace through research, first of all, and also through education and action is more important than ever. I hope, and also I'm glad, that with this international conference, we continue to work together to realize this vision of a more peaceful and equitable world for all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ginevra. Now we give the floor to our third panelist, Paolo De Stefani, Professor of International Law of Human Rights, a pillar of the Human Rights Center and the mind and effort behind many of the great activities our degree programs offer, especially the master degree program in human rights and multi-level governance you are representing with this short speech. Thank you.
I suppose I have to stand as well. And thank you. Thanks to the Human Rights Center and all the other organizations that have prepared this wonderful conference. It's the 9th edition of this conference. It started many years ago with a small group of partners. Now the group is slowly expanding, including more and more universities and so, of course, researchers, panelists, and students. Here I am representing the master's degree in human rights and multilevel governance. I'm speaking on behalf of her director, which is, or president, I think is the name, which is Professor Sara Pennicino, who couldn't come here today for some reasons. And so I'm just, grateful to the Human Rights Center and to the other organizations for preparing and organizing and holding these occasions. And because this is really an important, let's say, an important occasion for our students to not only listen about a lot of important and very, engaging topics concerning international relations, international law, development, discriminations, etc., but also to get in touch with researchers from all around, not only Europe, but also other parts of the world, to meet scholars, important scholars, to meet researchers, junior researchers, and so on. I think is an invaluable opportunity for all our students to be here, to be in the panels, and meet you. Thank you again, also from this perspective, for being here in Padova today and tomorrow, and bringing us and our students your expertise, your experience, and your knowledge, of course. Yesterday was the 36th, I think, yes, anniversary of the Berlin Wall, the falling of the Berlin Wall. So we are, let's say, every year, basically, or even every day, celebrating anniversaries of events that have, characterized the past decades, the past centuries, and so on, in the mark of, the development of humanity, the flourishing of human rights, peace. These are the events that we like to remember and celebrate. There is, I think, a generational element in our discourses, and I hope that in the panels today, in the speeches of today, these elements will be also, valued. The new generations are, confronting with these past events, events of the past, and they probably are, discussing or feeling what is going to be celebrated in the future about what is happening now. Will the war in Gaza celebrated in the next decades? Will the Ukrainian war be celebrated in the next decades? We are actually, witnessing situations that do not deserve a celebration in the next decades. So I think it's time for the new generations to create new facts, new events, new, deeds to celebrate in the future. And this is a desire and a need that the new people, the young people that we meet in class are really looking for. So we have to start building something that can be really celebrated in the next generation, by the next generations, in the next centuries, and so on. And this is the time to start doing something in this sense. So I really hope that from today and from tomorrow, from the discussions, from the interplays that we will have between scholars, experts, and the young people here in Padua, we will try to envisage some changes that can be usefully celebrated in the next decades and maybe in the next centuries. We need to do something positive now, in the face of what is happening day by day in the international scene. So with this hope, with this wish, I finish my short contribution, and I hope that the rest of the day and of this conference will be again an occasion for exchange, for enrichment, and for maybe also for friendship among the people that participate in these 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor De Stefani, Paolo, for these brief institutional sessions. Before I leave the floor for the opening plenary session, I'd like to provide you with some logistical information as well. So the conference follows a quite established pattern. After this session, you are all invited to the catered lunch that will be just out of this room in the Sala delle Colonne, in the so-called Basilica. Then the conference will move to the Human Rights Center Antonio Papisca, which is a walking distance from here, about 15 minutes, where we have 2 consecutive sessions or parallel panels. We start at 2:30. Finally, the conference will resume tomorrow at the Teatro Ruzzante, where we are having a final roundtable where the main themes and discussion of this conference will be approached by a panel of practitioners from international organizations, civil society, and the academia. Let me stress that this year, even more than in the past, in consideration of the unprecedented inputs we received for this conference, the organization of this event has required a collective effort of a human rights research and study community that has been built around the Human Rights Center and its programs for many years now. So I would like to take again just 1 minute to acknowledge this, to thank, of course, also the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies for having supported our conference since the very beginning. The colleagues from the International Institute that Professor Mascia has already listed one by one for building this solid human and professional partnership, which is at the basis of the sustainability of this event every year with the similar level of quality and interest. And then our wonderful students who, after having survived the intensity of teaching, extracurricular activities and exam, have found also the energies to establish student-led initiatives that provide an exceptional complement to our programs and initiatives here in Padova. And for the first time, these groups will be showcasing their activities starting from this afternoon, so during the session of the panels, and I really they will try to engage you in their activities, and I really recommend you take a minute to talk with them and listen to what they are doing, which is brilliant. And this group are the student engagement team, the advocacy hub, students' voices at the Human Rights Center, and last but not least, the LATAM, the Latin American Collective. So, and finally, of course, we can shape any scientific discussion we want, but in order to put in practice, there is a lot of organizational work. So let me again thank the constant effort of our staff for the constant effort in a very intense, in a particularly dense period of the year. We have many events in this November-December moment, in particular Anna, Sofia, Luca, Donatella, and Katia, and our volunteers in civil service, universal civil service at the Human Rights Center. Thank you very much. So we are ready for the plenary. So I'd like to invite here the chair of the session, Professor Damien Short, Professor Gamze Turkelli, Professor Nazila Ghanea, and Professor Ian Wouters. Thank you very much, and enjoy the conference.
Okay, welcome everyone. So we're going to have 3 wonderful speakers, and each one will be presenting, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I don't usually have trouble with volume. Okay, so to kick off then, we have the wonderful Nazila Ghanea, who became the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief in 2022. She's Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford, where she also directs the MSc program in International Human Rights Law. With nearly 30 years of experience, she has extensively researched, published, and consulted on human rights issues, particularly focusing on freedom of religion or belief. And you may be glad to know that we have no PowerPoint presentations this morning. It'll be merely the power of words. So without further ado, Nazila, over to you.
Thank you very much. Damien, I was expecting you to say, despite her youthful good looks, but you didn't, never. For you. This topic is very challenging, and I'm going to bring in, one dimension, or hope to sort of problematize just one dimension of it, and I hope it will contribute as an initial, this whole panel will help stimulate us towards the excellent presentations that are to follow in the next 2 days. Conflict levels have almost doubled over the last 5 years. In 2024 alone, there was a 25% increase in political violence events compared to 2023. This data is shared by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. The world is indeed headed towards greater violence, which precipitates tragic violations of human rights and demands urgent reflection and attention from all of us. So thank you for making this the subject matter of our considerations over the next 2 days. This reality that we all, tangibly feel around us led me to reflect also about the relationship between human rights and peace. We perhaps recall that in 2005, the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and his reform agenda emphasized the 3 pillars of a healthy, sustainable society as being those of peace and security, economic and social development, and the rule of law and human rights. And he emphasized that these 3 pillars of a sustainable society are interrelated and interdependent. He said, we will not enjoy development without security. We will not enjoy security without development, and we will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. In fact, as President Mascia just also drew attention to, this is also captured in Article 1 of the UN Charter, which we're marking, if not celebrating, this year. In Article 1 of the UN Charter, it says that the very aim of the foundation of this new entity, this new multilateral organization, was to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, wouldn't that be a good thing? Achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations towards common aims. We often see evidence of the opposite, and also to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction. But how do these pillars of peace and security, human rights and fundamental freedoms and development relate? In fact, I'm going to focus on only 2 of the pillars, so it's not going to be a stable stool, it only has 2 pillars, but let's focus in on peace and security and human rights and fundamental freedoms. What is the interdependency of these? And then I'm going to focus it even further and ask, what is the interdependency of the human right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion to peace and security? Now, the international instruments refer in, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, Article 18 of the ICCPR. They refer to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and we've abbreviated it, for example, in the name of the mandate, to religion or belief. But by religion or belief, we mean thought, conscience, and religion. So does the right to freedom of religion or belief, how does it sit with the right to peace, is the question. In my report to the General Assembly a year ago, report A7982, I grappled precisely with this question. You, I'm sure, know about the work of UN Special Rapporteurs. There's some 60 mandates. They are thematic mandates. 14 of them are country mandates. And they have emerged really since the 70s in order to carry out investigations and to report to the United Nations, but to do so as independent experts. The history of this mandate is one of the first 6 mandates ever created, and it has a bit of a rocky history. The General Assembly in the early 60s was concerned about the racial and religious riots that were occurring, decided to task the UN Commission on Human Rights to draft an instrument on racial and religious hatred. The racial part proceeded, and there was more momentum behind that. It led to our first UN Human Rights Treaty in 1965, the elimination of racial discrimination. Then the Commission returns back to that more problematic part, which was to deal with intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. And it took until 1981 for a declaration to be adopted on the elimination of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. And there was no energy left by that time, or any consensus for that matter, to draft a binding instrument. So perhaps, you know, as an alternative, as a fig leaf, 5 years later in 1986, the mandate was created. So it's a 39-year-old mandate, one of the longest standing remaining mandates of the United Nations. So over the last 39 years, there have been some 90 reports to the UN Human Rights Council, previously the UN Commission on Human Rights, and to the General Assembly, and 50 countries. There are 50 mission reports of country visits. In any case, so going back to, and it's the first time, interestingly, in that 39 years, that there has been a thematic report on peace and freedom of religion or belief. There have been 2 prior reports on conflict, minorities, religion or belief, so absolutely related. But I thought it would be quite timely to focus on the pillar of peace. So in carrying forward the mandate work, I'm very mindful of minority rights, the rights of religion and belief minorities, and the rights of indigenous peoples. I mean, just to sort of connect with the other themes of this conference. And therefore, it seemed relevant to draw from it in discussing rights, conflict, order, and disorder. The normative content of freedom of religion or belief has developed almost alongside those of the right to peace, which has been on the agenda of the United Nations for some 40 years. It was in 1984 that the General Assembly adopted its Declaration on the Rights of Peoples to Peace. And a more recent resolution was from 2024, Human Rights Council Resolution 5517 on human rights and a culture of peace. We know that the normative instruments on the rights of minorities and indigenous peoples came a little bit, you know, crystallized more recently than that. But of course, they do all have points of connection between them. In the Pact for the Future, adopted last year in September 2024, attention was drawn to some of the connections between these seemingly disparate topics. For example, the Pact for the Future refers to interreligious and intercultural dialogue, the need to eradicate religious discrimination and intolerance, and the importance of faith-based organizations in seeking to contribute to such challenges. Therefore, there seems to be an underlying hypothesis in the Pact for the Future that freedom of religion or belief can support peace. So we recognize their mutual importance to one another, but how do we best understand the relationship between these rights? In the Declaration and Programme of Action on a Culture of Peace, the General Assembly notes that peace is not only the absence of conflict, but also requires a positive, dynamic, participatory process where dialogue is encouraged and conflicts are solved in a spirit of mutual understanding and cooperation, as Professor Ginevra just mentioned too. A positive, sustainable peace was also the definition I was relying on in last year's GA report. Now let's draw some inspiration from the scholarship, as the reports did too. Much of the scholarship relates to peace and religion. There's a particular, and I find quite compelling, strand in that research that recognizes religion as being ambivalent in the extent to which it contributes either to conflict or to peace. Religion rarely stands alone as a factor that motivates resort to violence, this literature argues, but rather it acts in conjunction with other factors and grievances. So let's unpack this a little bit. You look all a bit skeptical at the moment, so I will refer in more detail to that work. So first, regarding whether religion contributes to war or to peace, the literature recognizes that religion is ambivalent in that religion can inspire and be utilized to advance non-violence, conflict resolution, and peace, or it can inspire violence, conflict, and war. A very strong piece on this comes from Scott Appleby, where, and especially in his article from 1998 called Religion and Global Affairs, Religious Militants for Peace. Now, secondly, there is a very disturbing element to some of the literature as well, in that it's, you know, they go through case studies and data and indicate that religiously inspired violence is, by and large, more deadly than violence justified by other means. I mean, it gives me goosebumps in the negative sense when I, you know, realize that. And I think, you know, we all feel that that is true. So religiously inspired violence is, by and large, more deadly than violence justified by other means, and harder to bring to an end. So you're trying to, you know, bring a conflict to an end. If that conflict has referenced religion as a cause, it is much harder to end that conflict. However, we should also note that religion rarely stands alone as a factor that determines the resort to violence, but it acts in conjunction with other factors and grievances, as Monica Duffy-Toft's work particularly illustrates. Now, the mandate itself in, you know, those 50 country visits and in the those 90 country reports has also observed that discrimination and intolerance can result from a combination of a variety of economic, social, political, and cultural factors deriving from complex historic processes. You know, in a way, it doesn't make it any easier. It's not a simple account, but in fact, it problematizes it, that it observes that it's in conjunction with economic, social, political, cultural, historical factors that intolerance and discrimination and sometimes violence also results. And that is often alongside sectarian and dogmatic intransigence, as the mandate has referred to it. The risk of that intransigence increases where repression has not been addressed and the state has fallen short in its obligation to address it. So although there is no causal relationship, I would argue, and this literature would also support, there is no causal relationship between the denial of rights and violence, the scholarly literature recognizes that it's a risk factor to developing religious cleavages that then become an organizing principle for violence. So, multifactorial causes, then it might attach itself to religious cleavages, to you know, rights claims that have not been addressed over time, and then it becomes more bloody and harder to resolve. I mean, what a cocktail, right? And you might look, for example, at the work of Nordas, who looks at lessons from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana in putting that thesis forward. Now, thirdly, a regime's experience with religious conflict will lead it to be more repressive of religious groups into the future, for decades into the future. So if there has been an experience with religious violence, after a conflict has involved religion or invoked religion, religious repression is more likely to ensue creating a cycle of restrictions on freedom of religion or belief, which in turn becomes a religious cleavage that risks perpetuating further conflict. Now, I've seen this firsthand. So, for example, in my first country visit to Tajikistan, it seems like it was still 1997, okay? So the control of religion, the management, or what they might call the management of religion, they might call it even the positive management of religion from their perspective, but the way that religion or belief was severely controlled throughout the country for majority and minority alike in this context was as if we are living just after the civil war of Tajikistan between 1992 and 1997 that involved an Islamic political party that was then, the government took over, and there is still this very palpable fear that any kind of religious gathering or celebration or, whatever the occasion, that this will, lead to government opposition. And this kind of long shadow of conflict, I think we can also see in a different way in Singapore. Race riots of 1964, or in Malaysia, policies still dominated or overshadowed, it feels, by the race riots of 1969. So these tend to become the dominating organizing factors of religious and community life for decades later. So now, how do we balance this? What about religious violence? This is the mandate on freedom of religion or belief. So is there the risk that it will sugarcoat the existence of religious violence? Will it seek to just overlook it or pretend that everything is rosy when it comes to religion or belief? Absolutely not. In that the mandate has long recognized, and I think since it's my predecessor's work, I will also celebrate that I think it quite effectively captures the phenomenon of discrimination and violence in the name of religion or belief. That is based on or arrogated to the religious tenets of the perpetrator, but it might be motivated because of a different religion or belief of the target, okay? So one can reject a causal relationship between violence and religion, but not sugarcoat that actually it is a reference point and a motivating factor for violence. Okay? I think we can bring these two, we can acknowledge both together. But I think in the mandate it's really important not to seek to become an arbiter of which violence, conflict, and war is actually due to religion and which one is merely in the name of religion. States will often try to dump this on you and say, well, Azerbaijan does this, Armenia does this, or this country does this and this, and they try to capture and they try to polarize you and bring you on side, okay? But I think it's really important for the mandate not to do that. This is a human rights mandate. It's not one that offers or should seek to offer religious expertise or determinations, even though some of my predecessors have had excellent religious expertise as well. But one can never be an expert in all religions and beliefs. And as a special procedure mandate appointed by the Human Rights Council, the mandate is and should always be fundamentally and unapologetically in favor of human rights and peace for all in all contexts and circumstances. Okay, so going back, we've maybe you're persuaded, maybe you're not, it will come up in the Q&A, but we've tried to debunk arguments that put forward some kind of causal relationship between religion and violence. I think we should also add to that there is no causal relationship between an increase in religion and belief diversity and the risk of conflict and violence, because I think many states live in fear of that. Maybe it's convenient, maybe for them it's tantalizingly real, but they fear diversity and pluralism. Scholars, though, have observed that it is not diversity, whether cultural or religious, that is at issue, but how it is handled politically. This has also been reiterated by this mandate. that religious intolerance is not a natural outcome of diverse societies. The problem lies in the manipulation of diversity by a few individuals and groups. Now, we're recognizing the currency of religion in the call for conflict and in the perpetuation of conflict, violence, and war. We recognize that it has a currency, but this is not an endorsement that religion should be used for this purpose. And it never suggests that a particular religion or belief is inherently or necessarily violent. It is a mere acknowledgement that in a particular time, place, and context, religion has in fact been mobilized in order to seek to justify violence, conflict, and war. What's more important is to try and recognize when the currency of religion can be mobilized away from this negative towards positives. I don't know enough literature about this, and I don't know if there are projects that investigate about it, but please do share with me, because I think this deserves a lot more attention. How do we use this currency towards positive peace and away from conflict and war? So there are all these essentializing and extensive assumptions about religion, insecurity, and war, and they leave a deep imprint on how states relate to their international obligations on freedom of religion or belief. So irrespective of their ratifications and obligations, they run on these assumptions, and they perpetuate them in their societies. So whether implicitly or explicitly, many states are selecting between good religion and bad religion. Maybe you recall Mahmoud Mamdani's 2002 piece, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, that relates to a similar idea. States create hierarchies of protection in freedom of religion or belief, whether very explicitly in ID cards and recognized and unrecognized religions, or in a more soft sense. And this perpetuates discrimination and inequality. And they do so particularly in contexts of laying out, who is an extremist, who is a terrorist, and their so-called counter-terrorism efforts, which marginalize religion and belief minorities around the world. So this gives me an opportunity to bridge from religion and peace to freedom of religion or belief and peace. What is that relationship? What does that look like? The report, the GA report from last year, says that freedom of religion or belief mandates legal protection of, respect for, and fulfillment of the rights of all and of religion or belief minorities. Now, I won't go into that. You know what this mandate should call for. And it was a reminder to states about their critical obligations, human rights obligations in general, but also of giving effect fully and equally to freedom of religion or belief for everybody. How really, though, does advancing freedom of religion or belief contribute to peace, or how can it really contribute to peace? By addressing the root causes of violence and conflict, let's step back. By upholding freedom of religion or belief in its fullness, we can address the root causes of violence and conflict and harness its, the transformative potential of human rights. Whilst when fully respected, freedom of religion or belief, I argue, creates circumstances in which alternative ideas of security and peace can develop that challenge the normalization of militarization of war, militarization and war. Did that make sense? So, if conscience is liberated in the fullest sense, thought, conscience, religion, and belief, then the opportunity to stand against this creeping but palpable normalization of the military, our resources just all going from well-being to warfare, the conscience can stand against that. So this has implications for conflict transformation as well, and a freedom of religion or belief can contribute to that. It can allow for a broad and inclusive engagement and enrich justice processes and bolster sustainable peace and security. The report calls for concrete steps to be taken to guarantee freedom of religion or belief, in order to create an environment to free the conscience from manipulation, division, polarization, and instrumentalization. How else does religion become an organizing principle of conflict, of holy war, of violence? It's by being instrumentalized. How can people stand against that instrumentalization? It's by being able to interpret their religion or belief, to understand their thought, conscience, and religion, to be allowed an environment for an exchange of ideas that can resist that and organize against that. This also allows us to stand against the securitization of religion and belief minorities around the world, and ensuring their equality and non-discrimination. So in summary, it is where freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief is respected that alternative movements and pro-peace narratives are more likely to emerge. The public is less likely to be captured by the political instrumentalization of division and hatred and othering on the basis of religion or belief. By upholding freedom of religion or belief, the state would allow freedom of thought, conscience, and religion to have its intended purpose. As the Kokkinakis case of the European Court from 1993 said, it's to allow freedom of religion or belief to achieve its intended goal of being a far-reaching and profound human right. This freedom liberates persons to remain authentic to their own conscience, whether in pursuit of ancestral affiliations or of changing their religion or belief. The freeing up of the conscience, as called for by freedom of religion or belief, frees the conscience from manipulation. It stands against the co-option of populations for legitimizing war and allows them, as Appleby says, to become militants for peace. The freeing of conscience calls not only for the positive obligations of states, but also needs support at the society and community level and some responsibilities on all of us. It cuts across both the internal and external dimension of freedom of religion or belief to allow us to interpret our religion or belief, especially in times of polarization. If we are able to stand against the tide of conflict, if we are able to refuse to accept the distortion and utilization of religion or belief for othering and conflict, then we can resolutely stand for peace for everybody. There's a bunch of recommendations. I feel I'm exceeding my time. So let me just link back to the themes of this conference. In addressing the threats to conflict and world order, we cannot ignore the myths and assumptions made by that are being made about the relationship between religion and peace on the one hand, and peace and freedom of religion or belief on the other. I've tried to problematize some of the myths about the relationship between religion and conflict in the literature, and then present freedom of religion or belief as the very tool that can enable the opposite, that is, of religion or belief actors being enabled to arise as warriors of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazila. Very thought-provoking. Thank you. And impeccable timekeeping. Excellent. So you've set the bar very high. Okay, so next up we have Gamze Erdem Dürkeli, who is an Associate Research Professor at the Law and Development Research Group of the University of Antwerp. Her work is situated in the interface of international law, human rights law, and sustainable development. She is the principal investigator of the ERC Starting Grant 2023, the Genesis project. So, Gamze, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I'd first like to thank our colleagues here at the Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca, at the University of Padova, for this kind invitation and this extremely, extremely timely event on human people's rights in the collapsing multilateral order. Grazie mille. It's also a privilege and an honor to be addressing you this morning, most of all the young generation of scholars, practitioners who may be taking human rights practice scholarship forward in the next decades. And I do echo Paolo's sentiments that a new narrative needs to be written, and you are probably going to be those writing it. My intervention today will center on the rise of multi-stakeholderism in the context of a collapsing multilateral order. So as Professor Ghanea was mentioning, speaking about that connection between peace and security and respect for human rights, I will bring in the third pillar of development or sustainable development. So this will fit hopefully nicely and follow up from the first keynote. Essentially, multi-stakeholderism, it's a model of governance that brings together, as the name implies, multiple stakeholders. That can range from public actors such as states or state institutions and intergovernmental organizations to private actors like business enterprises, public interest, civil society, or philanthropic actors, so charitable foundations and others. Multi-stakeholderism, it can take place in domestic settings, but today I will speak to what happens in the international arena. I'll first lay out how multi-stakeholderism has started to rise slowly since the beginning of the 1990s onwards, and the conditions under which it has continued to flourish. So for the students in the room, there's a lot of historical context from before you were born, probably, but some of us were already around, and unfortunately, many of the current human rights challenges do take their roots from many, many decades ago, as Professor Ghanea was also mentioning, of those struggles that may be still palpable in the current situation, whether they be kind of taking their roots in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s. And then I'll speak a little bit to what this turn to, or the rise of multi-stakeholderism, has meant for the multilateral system. And finally, try to tie together some of those strings and address multi-stakeholderism when considered together with the current background of ever-diminishing financial resources for multilateral action, whether that be on sustainable development, climate action, realization of human rights more broadly, and the increasing turn to rearmament and securitization of foreign policy that we're seeing day by day. So multi-stakeholderism, it started its slow rise in the 1990s onwards as an alternative to multilateralism, because many of these policymakers, practitioners, were very unhappy about the slow pace of intergovernmental negotiations. The new instruments had to be negotiated. It took a lot of time. But the global challenges were really impending. They were very urgent. They needed to be confronted. And a lot of this happened in the sustainable development governance domain. It was at a time when globalization was becoming a buzzword and so-called governance without government was becoming popularized. So in this context, global governance emerged, and I'm quoting the late political scientist James Rosnow, a response to governance gaps, evolving in a context of hope and progress, a sense of breakthrough, an appreciation that old problems can be circumvented and moved towards either the verge of resolution or the edge of obsolescence. The diplomatic side of multi-stakeholder engagement in global policy has also been termed polylateralism, for instance, where states and non-state actors formally, but also informally, can come together at the table to make global policy on a variety of issues. So multi-stakeholderism essentially offers, or seems to offer, an alternative path. It often does so using a partnership formula, where there's a partnership between states, the business sector, civil society, and often also intergovernmental organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and others. Multi-stakeholder partnerships were first proposed in the domain of environmental governance in the run-up to the 1992 Rio Summit Rio Earth summits that Pietro also mentioned, as an alternative to international legal implementation mechanisms, which were seen as very difficult, lengthy to negotiate. Of course, during the same time the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, it entered into force a short 2 years later, but the implementation was seen as a very big challenge, and so there was this willingness to imagine alternatives that would not replace but would complement international legal policy making. In the year 2000, Hilary French wrote in Vanishing Borders, Protecting the Planet in the Age of Globalization, reversing ecological decline in the early decades of the new century will require innovative partnerships between many different actors, including NGOs, businesses, governments, and international organizations. In fact, the premise and the promise of multi-stakeholderism was a positive one. State-to-state negotiations were too lengthy, too dependent on foreign policy imperatives. They were also mired by power asymmetries. Multi-stakeholderism was and is naturally very appealing. On the surface, involving multiple stakeholders in global governance sounds like it can help address some of the shortcomings of multilateralism, which are and include state centricity, a hierarchical top-down approach to policymaking, lack of inclusiveness. As opposed to state-to-state setup of the multilateral system, multi-stakeholderism can possibly broaden the policy-making base by bringing in a variety of different voices, perspectives from different stakeholder groups, including grassroots perspectives and non-dominant viewpoints, for instance, of indigenous peoples, which we'll be discussing this afternoon in some of the parallel sessions. It can thus, at least the promise was, balance the overly state-centric policymaking that multilateralism was at least initially predicated upon. And so the sense of progress and change can explain how multi-stakeholder approaches flourished in previously unregulated domains like internet governance that were essentially cross-border and collaborative, but also in sort of these so-called wicked problems of climate, biodiversity, and others. And the broader turn, of course, to multi-stakeholderism beyond environmental policy making or beyond, let's say, internet governance, that's more recent. Although in the context of world history, but still dates from 25 years ago with the Millennium Development Goals at the time calling for a global partnership for development, where it led to the expansion of multi-stakeholderism into areas where multilateral interventions fell short. In 2002, the Johannesburg Summit said we can have those alternative arrangements of implementation. And so multi-stakeholderism began to be seen as a one-model-fits-all solution to collective action problems globally. Fast forward 15 years, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals then really created specific action points for multi-stakeholder partnerships, and I quote, to mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology, financial resources to support the achievement of sustainable development goals in all countries, in particular developing countries. And a further target was to encourage and promote effective public and private, and civil society partnerships, building on the experience and resourcing strategies of partnerships. So basically, the idea was that we would use existing multi-stakeholder partnership models to create more multi-stakeholder partnerships, a kind of mushrooming, if you will. And that model was deployed not outside of the multilateral system, but through the United Nations, which is the custodian of multilateralism globally, through platforms such as the SDG Partnership Accelerator. Today, we see that multi-stakeholderism as a model permeates key public goods and services which are governed, and I bring in here the human rights norms. The human rights legal norms and their protection is mandated in these areas, these key areas like health, education, access to water, food, but even refugee protection. Some of the notable examples, just to give you an idea, include, and you may have heard of these, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Global Partnership for Education, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and there are many, many, many others. One of the latest frontiers of multi-stakeholderism is peace and security, including peace building, a central theme, I think, of this conference. So I believe going forward, we really need to keep an eye out on how multi-stakeholder approaches will start to also permeate and possibly dominate the peace and security field. And multi-stakeholderism, it emerges as a model that promises agility, speed, flexibility to address these challenges. Often, multiple stakeholders will come together because they have a common interest in something. And they want to remedy a supposed failure of, often the supposed failure of the multilateral system to address it in an effective and timely manner. All the while, unfortunately, the same stakeholders may be working behind closed doors and supporting policy that undermines and erodes the capacity of the multilateral system to respond to the said challenge. And in practice, of course, if we think about it, multi-stakeholderism is also plagued by the same power asymmetries that underlie the multilateral system. Asymmetries in economic power, asymmetries in political power, and social power. But these asymmetries may become hidden or obscured, or at least less obvious, because the model is predicated on everyone seemingly having the same kind of seat at the table. But there isn't an honest reckoning about whether that seat at the table can be used in the same effective manner by all stakeholders involved. So then, multi-stakeholderism can be actually providing a veneer of inclusion and voice and even equality, while powerful actors do carve out a space for themselves and be able to influence or even guide policymaking in domains of interest to them. As a consequence, unless we have inclusion and inclusiveness built in explicitly into these initiatives, approaches, partnerships, multi-stakeholderism may in fact help legitimize power asymmetries and imbalances. And what is interesting is that is not only between states, as multilateralism has done, but also between powerful private actors and states or other types of public actors. And it's true that many multi-stakeholder partnerships, initiatives, they do not exist outside of the multilateral system as such. In fact, they seek to be firmly embedded within and utilize those multilateral networks to buttress their legitimacy and expand their global reach. Let's take the example, just one example as a thought exercise of healthcare delivery. What happens often is a number of wealthy donor countries, states, are presented a proposal by often a powerful private actor, a philanthropic actor often, let's say on healthcare delivery in one or multiple developing countries. That delivery is supposed to take place in the context of often preventing or treating an infectious disease or providing a specific service. And then these philanthropic, powerful private actors, they tend to be often the personal private foundations of ultra-net worth individuals who have often accumulated their wealth because they're not taxed the way that you and I are taxed as employees, or the corporate foundations of transnational corporations. The proposal is then presented to the donor governments, and it also is presented to intergovernmental organizations, let's say in the case of healthcare, to the World Health Organization. Often the World Bank is brought in as kind of a trustee for the funds that will be accumulated. The new partnership often also involves existing partnerships like the Global Fund or Gavi that are the brainchilds, for instance, of the Gates Foundation. My previous research on these models has shown that, in fact, these models often, and others have written on this, McKeon and others, that they prioritize market-based approaches and financialized approaches and models, and can lead to further financialization of development assistance, but also diversion of public funds towards more private sector initiatives. And then there's the big human rights accountability question. In this kind of setup, to whom does an individual human rights holder turn to in order to demand accountability for their rights if, for instance, their right to access to healthcare has not been realized? Many of the more established transnational multi-stakeholder partnerships have been built internal accountability mechanisms because they noticed some of the shortcomings. There were concerted civil society efforts to hold them to account in this way, but they're often able to sidestep external mechanisms for public accountability, especially in relation to human rights. And that's, that's partly due to their unclear status under international law, particularly international human rights law, and their the lack of direct international legal human rights duties incumbent upon them. When we have a setup where there are multiple states, both donor and recipient, and we have that international cooperation obligation, we also have international organizations, businesses, non-governmental organizations, and philanthropic actors jointly undertaking action. How do we understand the attribution and distribution of human rights obligations among them? And how do we then attribute and distribute responsibility for violations if they occur? In the multilateral system, we have a variety of hard and softer legal mechanisms that guide that duty bearing, the attribution and distribution. We have the international human rights treaties, the jurisprudence of international courts, as well as international treaty bodies, authoritative pronouncements of the treaty bodies themselves in the form of general comments, and softer but authoritative mechanisms like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In a multi-stakeholder decision-making system, who owes what duties to whom is at best unclear, at worst it is obscured. In fact, in Antwerp, my colleagues and I are working on a project to try to sort of understand what happens in these contexts. But putting human rights accountability aside for a minute and coming back to the central theme of this conference, which is the collapsing, eroding multilateral order, how has multi-stakeholderism been contributing to this? So let me again bring up a real case, a recent real-life example, which was the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This emerged as this time-bound, immediate multi-stakeholder response to the COVID-19 pandemic, bringing together private foundations, pharmaceutical companies, international organizations, the World Bank and others, and a lot of donor states to work on developing diagnostics, therapeutics. It also relied on this mechanism so-called COVAX, which was a mechanism for voluntary vaccine donations from wealthy countries to developing countries. And instead of integrating into the existing healthcare and vaccine delivery systems of developing countries and instigating a systemic response, COVAX was created as a separate initiative, and it did end by the end of 2023. But the launch of this multi-stakeholder partnership was actually a pivotal moment because it signaled a turn away from more structural solutions embedded in multilateral processes. For instance, the negotiation of a patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines under the auspices of the World Trade Organization, which could have set a precedent for future pandemics and would have been actually allowing us to produce vaccines en masse for the world population, because we did have powerhouses like India or South Africa that could do this at a fraction of the cost if the patents were not going to be implemented. So let's try to do the math on multi-stakeholderism, or even the, I guess, anatomical dissection as we are in Padova. Multi-stakeholderism, in the form that it's existed over the last 3.5 decades in sustainable development, has been really pivotal in this turn towards privatization and market-based mechanisms for programming and delivering public goods and services. And while pushing for this kind of privatized and market-based mechanisms, it has still relied heavily on the support of the public sector through public financing and development, through donor governments, through multilateral institutions. And it has been playing this role with a number of consequences. First is the fragmentation both of policy and funding, often diverting public means for privatized ends, duplication of efforts and creation of parallel tracks for these goods and services, mainstreaming of corporate and privatized models that are fundamentally unaccountable to the public because they are private, so they're not set up as public efforts. Permeating through multilateral policy-making spaces and convincing policymakers that multilateral solutions are too rigid, too slow, too cumbersome, and allowing private actors to start dictating and exerting a disproportionate influence on the global agenda without being, again, accountable to the public. And the final consequence, and a very, very real consequence, is displacing the rights holders who would be at the center of these interventions as ultimate beneficiaries, and replacing it with nebulous concepts such as impact. Who knows how and by whom this will be measured. And given the ever-shrinking budgets for multilateral action on sustainable development, climate change, on the realization of human rights, the progressive realization also through international cooperation obligations, it is more than likely that we'll continue seeing an uptick of voluntaristic and private initiatives, probably under multi-stakeholder sort of umbrellas. While, if we think of it cynically, these may be the only alternatives that remain if public action dries up, more than likely they will be the kind of outsourcing mechanisms for limited public money that remains for developmental responses, but also more concerningly for humanitarian action. And many public, so it's not me saying it, it's many public interest civil society organizations, people's movements that have been saying it for a long time, warning about the co-optation of the multilateral system by corporate multi-stakeholderism, particularly in this private turn. And what I find worrying in the current context is that now we have a double challenge. On the one hand, we have an outward explicit attack on multilateral systems, particularly those supporting accountability, redistribution, restitution, as we saw the attack on UNRWA, for instance, but that's just to name a few, the defunding of the UN system by those that ought to be funding it. On the other hand, we have the presentation of solutions that consequently erode the multilateral system even further. And we're witnessing this in climate change policy, in migration and refugee policies, in sustainable development, and again, extremely worryingly, in humanitarian crises. On its own, of course, multi-stakeholderism cannot be held responsible for the process of this collapse altogether. But taken together with the rising authoritarianism, unjustified limitations on civil and political rights and freedoms, such as the curtailing of freedom of expression or increasing persecution of minorities based on race, religion, ethnicity, sexual and gender orientation, and identity, we see that the erosion of the international and domestic rule of law leaves it open for powerful actors, including powerful private actors, to exploit the shortcomings of the multilateral system to the detriment of the rights holders, human rights holders, and the environment. And while critiquing multi-stakeholderism and its impacts, I don't have any illusions about the existing multilateral system and its shortcomings. In a very real sense, multi-stakeholderism has been an even more problematic alternative to an already deficient system. The Security Council, which, as the UN Charter says, has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, has been ineffectual to the point of losing its legitimacy. And this has been because of the failures, mostly of the permanent members, to discharge their duties due to their implication, the very violations of peace and security. Throughout the genocidal violence in Gaza, the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the armed conflict in Sudan, where third states are also implicated and elsewhere. The UN Security Council's recent vote on Western Sahara, taking as basis Morocco's autonomy proposal, also leads us to call into question whether even peremptory norms of international law, jus cogens, like self-determination, are being or beginning to be undermined by the very institution, the highest institution that is supposed to protect them. And there's a chasm between the Security Council on the one hand and the General Assembly on the other. And that shows the chasm between military and economic powers and the majority of world states. from the United for Peace resolution in the 1950s to the declaration granting independence to colonial peoples and countries and peoples, from the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to the adoption of the landmark resolution on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the majority of world states have actually been leading the charge on the protection of human and environmental rights globally under the auspices of the UN General Assembly. So that is hope. That is sort of cause for hope. And in fact, the peoples in developing countries, particularly those who have experienced colonization and continuing coloniality, are currently the most ardent guardians of the multilateral system. And it's important to think about why those that have been historically disadvantaged and exploited by the system of international law, particularly prior to decolonization, but also since, support the multilateral order. I think it's because while the shortcomings need to be reformed, and that's clear, there are key values to be preserved, particularly the norms that have been adopted to protect human dignity, to build and preserve peace, and to protect the environment. And to end on a hopeful note, international law is not only what states make of it, but also what we as human rights holders do. And those of us in wealthier, more powerful states who have the material privileges should be at the forefront of holding our governments, our states to account for their roles in the impending collapse of the multilateral order, not least by outsourcing their obligations to private and hybrid actors and watering them down. We should do so not only to prevent the collapse of the multilateral order, but to imagine something better, a more just, equal, and equitable order that also addresses the shortcomings of the existing order. And as human rights and international law scholars and practitioners, we should also take this responsibility not only to heart, but to practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Gamze. I've got quite a few questions, but I shall leave them to abuse chair's privilege at the end. Okay, so finally we have Jan Wouters, who is a full professor of international law and international organizations at the Leuven Center for Global Governance. He is a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium for Sciences and Arts and holds the role of counsel at Omega Law in Antwerp. He has authored or edited a staggering 80 books and contributed to an even more unfathomable 400 journal articles and book chapters. His research spans international and EU law, global governance, and corporate and financial law. Jan, I understand you want to go into the lecture? Okay, over to you.
Dear colleagues, both young and slightly less young, those teaching international law today in our universities will probably recognize what has been happening to me in the past months. For quite some time, I will now regularly get questions by journalists who ask me, is your field of expertise still alive? Or does international law still exist? And it's not just journalists asking about that. Quite a number of distinguished colleagues from other fields of the law also come with those questions. Now, let's face it, those remarks are not new. They come back from time to time. I do remember that similar suggestions or hints were made when the US and the UK invaded Iraq back in 2003. And I personally think that international law has much more resilience than that. And when I get those questions from journalists about does international law still exist, I tell them, you know, if the number of murders in Brussels increases, does that mean that the Belgian criminal code does not exist anymore? It's the same thing. But let me ask the questions that the organizers of this great conference have asked us. to critically address the current crisis of international law and of human rights mechanisms within the broader perspective of the major challenges that multilateralism is facing. And so I propose I first offer my diagnosis on the crisis of international law, the crisis of human rights mechanisms, and the challenges that multilateralism is facing. And that I then develop a couple of reflections on how I think we should address this triad of crisis, because that's what it is, a triad of crisis. So let me start with the crisis of international law. Those of you from my slightly less young generation will remember an album from Supertramp with the title Crisis, What Crisis? It dates from 1975, can you imagine? Crisis, what crisis? Supertramp. And that's the question I want to ask, because I will not deny that there are severe challenges for international law today, but I would argue that these have always been there, and that we have just a little forgotten about them in light of some of the very big breakthroughs of international law in the past 35 years. What is going badly with international law today? Well, it's clear that we are constantly seeing grave violations of international law. It's true. The banalization of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocidal acts, it's really frightening. And there is certainly a persistent problem of impunity and lack of accountability for such crimes, as Professor Mascia already said. Right? But at least we know they are happening. We are being informed about them, and we do care. Our media are far from perfect. Compare the daily attention to the Middle East, Ukraine, to the scant attention for the worst armed conflicts in terms of human suffering, such as Sudan. So the media are imperfect, but at least we receive regular reports about mass atrocities around the world. There were times that the general public simply did not know they were occurring due to lack of information, due to systematic disinformation from governments, or due to collective amnesia. Remember what Hitler said to his henchmen: who remembers the Armenians? Yeah. So I think we're better off today, all in all. But let me come especially to the field of international humanitarian law, where I think we see the most of those grave violations today, and where the question of enforcement remains especially critical. I'm pushing all these things here, and I hope I can get them back in order. Yeah, something, well, whatever. Let's come to international humanitarian law. So there are these grave violations. There is a great problem of impunity, the weakness of international and even domestic mechanisms to address them. But I would like to address a problem that I consider at least as worrying as those systematic violations. And that's what I see as the lack of development, the further development and deepening of the laws of war, and the risk that they are becoming increasingly irrelevant and outdated. What do I mean? Last year, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and rightly so. It's a superb achievement. These conventions are about the only treaties that have been universally ratified by all states, and they've had a major impact on the humanization of warfare. But they are more and more becoming like old rusty skyscrapers that would need to be either thoroughly renovated or replaced by newer structures. But the problem is that there is no political will in the international community to update these conventions. Even the 2 additional protocols of 1977 need such updates now. And that need is great. Can it be? How can it be that currently in the world 95% of armed conflicts, so-called non-international armed conflicts, are only partially regulated by international treaty instruments? Today, we live in an era with some of the most rapid and revolutionary developments in warfare, and we see it before our eyes. AI, automated weapon systems, drones, and so on. Will humanity need a new global conflict before we start thoroughly adapting the laws of wars to today's realities? It is a horrible thought, but as I teach in my classes on humanitarian law, the history of the laws of war shows us that indeed it always took a war before we got new impulses to the further development of humanitarian law. So I hope the history will not prove us right and that we will need again major conflicts. Now, I think I spoke about humanitarian law, but I really feel I have to generalize this point. States today, in general, are not so keen on updating the major multilateral treaties that have come about in the post-World War II international order. From the United Nations Charter, reforming it is almost impossible, to the 1951 Geneva Convention, to the major United Nations human rights conventions. Yes, as Professor Stefani highlighted, we are currently celebrating many anniversaries, one after the other, and that's great. Next year, 60 years of the two international pacts, right? ICCPR and the one on economic, social, and cultural rights. And of course, we can and we should and we do interpret those treaties in a dynamic manner, as living instruments, as the European Court of Human Rights would say. But the question I would like to raise is, can we continue doing that? As these instruments turn 80, 90, 100 or more years old, how to ensure the renewal, the mise à jour, the rejuvenation of our most fundamental multilateral treaties? It's a problem for which we currently don't really have an answer. So for me, the crisis of international law is actually much more fundamental than the question of its daily violations. It is really about the need to strengthen and deepen and bring up to date international legal disciplines, rather than desperately preserving and celebrating old instruments that increasingly may be out of step with today's needs. Okay, that's one point about the crisis of international law. I come to a second diagnosis, the crisis of human rights mechanisms. Just a few days ago, Phil Lynch, the executive director of the International Service for Human Rights, addressed a meeting convened by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the President of the Human Rights Council, in which he spoke of a threefold crisis for the international human rights system. First, an accountability crisis, with atrocity crimes perpetrated with impunity in Sudan, Palestine, Ukraine, Afghanistan, among others. Secondly, what he calls a normative crisis, characterized by attacks on women's rights, LGBTI+ rights, international courts and mechanisms. And thirdly, as we have already heard, a funding crisis, with the UN human rights pillar being starved of resources. The latter means, of course, that there will be still fewer human rights violations that are being prevented, fewer human rights defenders that are being protected, fewer perpetrators that will be held accountable, and fewer just victims who receive justice. And let's face it, although I'm a fan of Antonio Guterres, the current proposals of the UN Secretary General as part of his UN at 80 program, they foresee in such major cutbacks for the human rights system. This is really very disturbing. So we have a problem there as well. The essence of the crisis, in my view, is the attack by especially autocratic leaders on human rights defenders and human rights mechanisms, which they see as a nuisance and a limitation of their power. It is part of a wider assault on civic space, with meanwhile over 118 countries that are placing serious restrictions on civil society. You know, the rise of the so-called foreign agents laws. A recent report of International IDEA indicates that this issue goes beyond human rights and is in the end about defending democracy. The capacity of democratic systems to resist backsliding and build their resilience is critical to reducing the risks of socio-political polarization and conflict, to enhancing economic prospects, to strengthening political stability, and to stemming shifts towards autocratic systems and the tendency to align with powerful authoritarian states. So that's the second diagnosis, the crisis of the human rights system. Then the crisis of multilateralism. It's of course coinciding. Those things are not happening in silos. It's coinciding with the two aforementioned crises. Let's face it, the multilateral global governance system that has been constructed over the past 8 decades is facing an unprecedented number of challenges, if not an outright existential crisis. Numerous factors contribute to this. And in the first place, one can point to a set of issues under the heading old age. La vieillesse. Yes, most of today's international institutions, especially those of the United Nations family, were created around the end of the Second World War, meaning they are currently in their 9th decade, respectable age. Institutional reform has always proven difficult in global organizations, and that is definitely the case for the United Nations, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on. One may think again of the long-standing need to reform the UN Security Council, which essentially has operated since 1945 with 5 permanent members from the Northern Hemisphere, with veto rights that are still paralyzing the decision-making process. Apart from this, apart from old age, la vieillesse, some organizations suffer from a stifling bureaucracy, politicization, siloization, meaning that they're all working in silos, one of the big problems of international law and global governance. While some emerging powers are seeking stronger representation and influence and contest the legitimacy of the current processes, we also unfortunately live in an era in which some of the established powers, like the US, have become unpredictable and frankly unreliable. Okay. But even, I mean, it's not just a question of old age, even younger international organizations. Think of the World Trade Organization, established 30 years ago, one of the youngest global organizations. It's currently in a major crisis because of the non-delivery of the Doha Development Agenda, the difficulty to agree on other new instruments, and of course, the demise of its appellate body, triggered again by the United States. Now let us also face the fact that there is currently a deliberate attempt of powerful states to make international organizations less relevant, if not irrelevant, defunding them, withdrawing from them. Think of Brexit, but think of the first executive orders of the Trump II administration, withdrawing from the WHO, from Unesco, from the Human Rights Council, from the Paris Agreement, withdrawal. But you don't necessarily need to withdraw from an international organization to frustrate it. You can obstruct from the inside, through politicization, through putting your people at strategic positions, through blocking things such as the appointment of new judges in the appellate body of the WTO, and so on. It's a very cynical game. But on the other hand, we should also admit that international organizations themselves often have difficulties living up to the expectations of their membership. And their capacity to rejuvenate themselves is also sometimes problematic. Now, a word about the European Union. The European Union itself is now also in its 8th decade, if one counts the earlier European communities. And it's not immune to crisis. While the EU has been able to reform itself through various treaty reforms, especially over the last 15 years, you could actually say that it has faced one crisis after the other. The financial crisis, the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, COVID-19, an energy crisis in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not to speak of the backsliding of the rule of law and democracy in quite a number of its member states. And I would add today, it's a pity I have to say that, but a much weaker commitment of the EU itself to human rights in its foreign policy than before. I come back to that. But also something else which is at least as worrying. What we witness is an enormous geostrategic and geopolitical weakness of the European Union in face of the Trump administration. You have only to think back of last summer with the incredibly humiliating trade deal that was imposed. It was not negotiated, it was imposed upon the European Union, the so-called Turnberry deal, right? And so, I'll come back to the EU, but now I come to my, say, proper proposals on how to address these crises. And of course, there is no magic bullet to solve those crises. They are clearly interdependent. But let me start by saying that sometimes it feels like we are all prisoners of an international legal system that was constructed in the course of a different era. And by that I mean the Westphalian international legal order based upon the coexistence of sovereign nation states. True, the United Nations Charter, whose 80th anniversary we are celebrating now, was built upon that order, emphasizing as it does the so-called sovereign equality of states, principles such as non-intervention. But of course, as you all know, this is only half of the truth. Kofi Annan, Secretary General Kofi Annan, made a famous address to the UN General Assembly in September 1999, when the international community was very divided after NATO's military intervention in the Kosovo crisis. Kofi Annan then spoke very eloquently about a tale of two sovereignties on which the UN is based. Two sovereignties, the traditional Westphalian sovereignty of states, but also the sovereignty of the individual, by which he meant the inalienable fundamental rights of every human being, which that same United Nations had developed through the international human rights system, starting with those scattered references to human rights in the UN Charter, and of course further developed since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think indeed that keeping those two sovereignties firmly in mind offers some of the keys for addressing the three aforementioned crises. But I also think that some additional elements may be needed here. One additional element is today's interdependence of the international community. Now let me go back in time. More than 60 years ago, in 1964, the famous Columbia international law professor Wolfgang Friedman wrote a book called The Changing Structure of International Law. And Friedman began by considering the main changes that by that time had taken place in international law. What did he see? He saw the vertical extension of international law to new areas, economic cooperation, welfare, and so on. He saw the big horizontal expansion to take in all the civilizations. It was in the middle of the decolonization process, all the cultures of the world coming in. And then he examined three main levels of international law. He distinguished three sorts of international law. First, the law of coexistence, the traditional international law between strongly independent sovereign states, where the role of international law is actually very limited. It's a bit of diplomatic interstate law. Then he saw there is another emerging field of international law, the law of cooperation on a universal level. But in his days, 1964, that law of cooperation was severely hampered by the big ideological divides, especially the Cold War. And then he saw a third level of cooperation law at the regional level, where he mentioned already the European communities at the time, where he saw much bigger, greater possibilities for cooperation. And he was right in that. So the analysis 60 years back of Friedman remains valuable, but it needs an update. And it needs to be refined to adjust to today's globalized world. Globalization and connectivity have a profound, but in my view, largely understudied impact upon the fundamentals of the international community. And as I've written elsewhere, as the pace, the breadth, and the depth of globalization continue to grow in spite of all the setbacks, a quiet revolution is actually taking place in the legal sphere. Traditional public international law is slowly but surely being bypassed, or at least complemented by what I call an emerging law of global governance. What is typical for this process? Well, first of all, an increasing normative role for non-state actors, from international organizations to civil society networks to private business associations. Secondly, a very interesting, complex, fine-grained combination of hard, soft, and informal lawmaking at various levels of governance, international, regional, national, local. And then last, and much more problematic, sophisticated challenges to the safeguarding of accountability, democratic legitimacy, and the rule of law. Now, I want to apply this thinking to those three aforementioned crises, if I may, Mr. Chairman. First of all, international law and global governance. Public international law, as we know it, practice it, and teach it, has a number of flaws that today's crisis have laid bare. In my view, one of the central weaknesses lies in its outdated conception of the subjects of international law. Let's face it, the system continues to privilege states, even though power, authority, and norm-making are increasingly exercised by a multiplicity of non-state actors. International organizations, regional bodies, private corporations, financial institutions, civil society associations, even cities now participate in shaping global norms. So this diffusion of authority has generated what we might call a polycentric legal order, one that extends far beyond the interstate paradigm. This development brings both promise and peril. On the one hand, it enriches global governance by harnessing expertise, resources, and initiative from diverse actors. On the other hand, it also risks diluting responsibility and eroding accountability if it is not anchored in firm legal principles. So the task before us is not to lament the transformation of international law, but to ensure the firm embedding of the new forms of global regulation within a coherent framework of legality, transparency, and the rule of law. I come back to the European Union. We are here in Europe. We are here in one of the founding countries of the European communities. And let's face it, the EU has demonstrated that integration through law can replace the law of coexistence and can deepen the law of cooperation by going beyond intergovernmentalism and by pooling the exercise of sovereign powers. The supranational legal order of the Union, where law takes precedence over politics, where individuals are genuine subjects of the law, right? And that's a very important thing. That law of the European Union offers a powerful source of inspiration, I think, for other regions and for the world. I just come back from Colombia. I was in Bogota. We organized a conference at the occasion of the EU CELAC summit. I'm not sure if anybody here has read about that summit. It's not given much attention here, which is typical because we Europeans in general are not paying sufficient attention to Latin America. But so this weekend you had the EU CELAC summit, which is a major conference summit between all Latin American countries and the European Union. And what really struck me again when looking into the Latin American dynamics, they have a great continent, but they have an incredible fragmentation of regional and sub-regional organizations. They haven't been able to really muster all of that together in one powerful, well-functioning regional organization, as we have actually done with the European Union in the course of the past decades. So I'm not saying the EU is a model. Really, don't quote me like that. I'm saying it should be a source of inspiration in spite of all its flaws, because indeed it can offer some ways I think, examples to other regions in the world to work more closely together. And from being regional organizations, being recognized as international players. The EU is a member of the G20, you know, and fortunately 2 years ago, the African Union was made a member of the G20. I hope that this will indeed slowly but surely lead to a further recognition of the role of regional organizations. And who knows, maybe at some stage, very utopian, even at the table of the Security Council. Now, so the EU, great. And also when you read the Treaty of Lisbon, those beautiful articles about the EU's role in global affairs. Take Article 21 of the Treaty on European Union, which says that the EU, in all of its relations with the wider world, is seeking to promote democracy, the rule of law, the universality and indivisibility of human rights, multilateralism. And it's true, through its trade agreements, through its development policies, through diplomatic engagement in a wide variety of multilateral processes, the EU is striving to what Article 3, paragraph 5 of the TEU calls the strict observance and development of international law. But things can be improved and should be improved. And we should never view the EU's external policies through too idealistic glasses. I come back to this. But let me already summarize for now with regard to how I see international law. If international law is to remain a meaningful instrument of justice, it must further evolve from a system of coordination to a system of cooperation and even integration, from a set of static norms to a dynamic architecture of global governance, from an exclusive domain of states to a shared enterprise of humanity through a multiplicity of non-state actors. This will require enormous political will, institutional innovation, and a lot of engagement by all of us. Civil society actors, diplomats, judges, lawmakers, business enterprises, and of course, academics. Above all, it requires faith that law, when grounded in principle and applied impartially, can still tame power and channel it towards the common good. That's what I think should happen with international law. I'll come to human rights. The second element concerns the crisis and the renewal of the international human rights system, and we are witnessing today not only widespread violations, but also the more insidious challenge of the erosion of universality. And we know the story. Human rights are very often still dismissed as Western, selective, ideological, but the moral and legal truth remains that human rights do not derive from cultural civilization, but from the inherent dignity of every human being. And in defending this universality, we must also defend the institutions that give it life. The United Nations human rights mechanisms, regional courts, treaty bodies, the countless NGOs and defenders who operate more and more under threat. And we already spoke about the chronic underfunding of these institutions, which is even threatened more today, as I said, in the latest proposals of the Secretary General. This is not just a budgetary issue. It is a political statement about our collective priorities. Investing in human rights protection is investing in peace, stability, and human development. And here again, I come back to the European Union, because I really think that European states and the EU bear a very special responsibility here. Now, when you look at the last 16 years, which is in a sense the period that the Treaty of Lisbon has been in force, you must admit that some important positive strides have been made. Within the EU, I'm not sure if you're all following within the EU, but we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which enshrines both civil, political, economic, and social rights in a single instrument that now has the status of primary law, as we say it in EU terms, and that is increasingly, say, progressively developed and interpreted by the European Court of Justice. By the way, we are preparing a MOOC on the Charter of Fundamental Rights because that was the explicit demand of the European Commission. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, to be honest, is not sufficiently known, not even within the European Commission and the European institutions. So there will be a MOOC from the beginning of next year onwards. But so that's great. And at the external level, since the Treaty of Lisbon, we have those beautiful provisions, as I said already, Article 21, 3.5 of the Treaty on European Union. And it is true there has been a more systematic engagement on human rights by the EU with the wider world. That includes the EU's rather systematic engagement at the Human Rights Council, session after session, the Third Committee of the General Assembly. It has developed now its global human rights sanctions regime, right? It has, of course, strong financial mechanisms to support civil society actors worldwide. And that indeed shows us how it is important that regional integration, in our case through the EU, can help to reinforce universal norms. But now, let's be frank, and let's not be naive. Over the past 10 years, more or less starting with what I would call the ugly deal-making with the notorious EU-Turkey statement in March 2016, we have actually seen how the EU is making human rights subordinate to its migration needs and policies. The silence and divisions on the atrocities in the Middle East, in great contrast besides to the 19 sanctions packages we adopted vis-à-vis Russia, the absence of a strong human rights stance vis-à-vis Arab states, on whose energy supplies we are now depending, and recently, I'm not sure if you already heard about that, but the total impotence of the EU in the face of the withdrawal by one of its own member states, Hungary, from the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court. All of these should act as serious warning signs that the EU really needs to renew and deepen its commitment to human rights, rather than weakening it. So in sum, in times when authoritarianism gains ground and civic space shrinks, our duty as scholars and citizens is to speak clearly that the universality of human rights is not negotiable. Their protection everywhere is a test of our humanity, a measure of our civilization, and the cornerstone of legitimate governance. Third point, multilateral cooperation. The renewal of multilateral cooperation is both the condition and the consequence of restoring faith in international law and human rights. The crisis of our century, climate change, pandemics, cyber insecurity, mass displacement, the weaponization of information, all those crises do not respect borders. The choice before us is to cooperate multilaterally or to simply fail collectively. You can say many things about multilateralism. There's been much critical literature about, yeah, it's rhetoric, it's talking and talking, it's symmetry and so on. But the true multilateralism is not about that. The true multilateralist spirit is about shared responsibility, mutual accountability, and the rule of law in global governance. It requires that states look beyond narrow interests and recognize that sovereignty today is exercised most effectively through cooperation, not isolation. The multilateral order built after 1945 may indeed show its age, but the principles remain sound. What we need is not its abandonment, but its renewal through institutional reform, inclusivity, and greater representativeness. Here too, and again, I apologize when I sound naive, my hope is that the European Union can and must lead. Why? Because the EU has shown that deep cooperation, even integration among states, grounded in law, guided by common values, can transform a continent once divided by war into a community of peace. Let's face it, let's never forget this continent triggered the 2 world wars, right? And it means we really still today have a major international responsibility. And I don't need to fantasize about that. If you reread the Schuman Declaration of the 9th of May 1950, I really counsel you to reread it. It starts with those historical phrases about, you know, the incredible instability and threats to world peace, 1950, the Korean War, and the contribution that a organized Europe can make to world peace. That's what the Schuman Declaration kicked off with. That's what you find also formulated in the preamble of the Coal and Steel Community Treaty, the very first community treaty. So yes, the EU has shown that deep cooperation can make a difference. And by championing, as it does in its treaties, the EU treaties mentions more than 20 times the United Nations. By championing the United Nations, by driving initiatives on climate action and digital governance, the EU can uphold multilateralism. But again, even here, under our own eyes, we see a recul happening today. I'm not sure if you're following this, but 2 weeks ago, there was a joint letter by the United States and Qatar, who sent a joint letter to EU leaders with a clear threat of discontinuing the supply of liquefied gas if the EU would not scale back its due diligence, its green laws, and so on. And actually, we see it happening under our eyes. Just a few days ago, you saw indeed that the EU, the Commission, is proposing to scale back some of the most innovative regulations on climate change, due diligence, and the regulation of digital services. They will, of course, never admit they give in to blackmail, but it's actually happening under our eyes. So, a reinvigorated multilateralism, to be short, should place the individual and the planet at its center. It must integrate human rights into all dimensions of global policy, trade, finance, security, and environment, and it should insist that sustainable development and human dignity advance together. Only such an integrated approach can rebuild the legitimacy of the international order and enable it to deliver on its promise of peace and justice. I come to my conclusion. I conclude with the conviction that lies at the heart of everything we are discussing, I think, those 2 days in Padova. The universality and indivisibility of human rights are not mere rhetorical flourishes of the post-war international order. They are the moral and legal foundation of our shared humanity. They remind us that dignity has no nationality, that suffering knows no borders, and that justice cannot be the privilege of a few. When one person's rights are denied, the humanity of all is diminished. And in that light, the strict observance of international law is not a luxury, it's not optional, it's essential. It is the vital, although fragile, thread that binds the international community together. To neglect or relativize it is to open the door to arbitrariness, to power politics, and ultimately to violence. But beyond the observance of international law, we really also have to commit to renewal, deepening, further development of international law. Law cannot remain static while the world around it changes. The Geneva Conventions, the United Nations Charter, the Human Rights Treaties, all are living instruments. Their continued vitality depends on our courage to adapt, to deepen them, so that they may continue to serve as bulwarks against barbarism and as instruments of progress in an age transformed by technology, climate disruption, and geopolitical flux. And then last but not least, let us reaffirm our faith in multilateral cooperation. However imperfect, it remains the only legitimate and sustainable way to confront the challenges of our time, be they armed conflict, global inequality, pandemics, or climate change. The crises we face are shared, and so must be the solutions. Let us therefore, and I admit it's not easy, let us resist the temptation of cynicism. International law is not dead. It lives wherever human beings insist on justice, wherever victims demand accountability, and wherever states and peoples choose cooperation over confrontation. The resilience of international law lies not in the absence of crisis, but in the determination to overcome them. And in renewing our commitment to universal human rights, to the rule of international law, and to genuine multilateralism, we are also renewing our commitment to humanity and to the enduring hope that reason, compassion, and justice can still prevail in world affairs. Thank you.
Well, thank you, speakers. Well, that was 3 fantastic papers, all of which drew attention to the various crises we have in the multilateralism system and the international legal system, which I think I really enjoyed the fact there was a note of optimism there at the end. How realistic some of these elements will be, I think we can interrogate in the questions. I have several myself, but I think I will leave them in case there's a lull in the room. But I presume we have a roaming microphone for any questions. Is this true? So what I suggest we do is take one question at a time, and if you could possibly introduce yourself and direct your question at one, or indeed two, or all of the speakers. That would be lovely. So, before I go, one question here at the front.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Adina Daku. I'm actually one of the panelists this afternoon. I would address the question to Professor Ghanea. So I heard a lot of words like fight for peace, militants for peace, warriors of peace, whereas these are like completely opposite than the peace. And so I was wondering if you could comment, and of course other panelists can comment on that as well. Like, do we really need to use that language? Because for me that implies that peace is not possible without war or without fight. And I'm wondering if that serves the cause. I'm wondering, because you also mentioned, you know, religion, and I work a lot with beliefs, whether it's religion or anything else, and how that influences behavior. So for me, this fight for peace implies the belief, you know, the belief that I mentioned earlier, that peace is not possible without fight, war, and I'm wondering if that's not actually fueling the fight, the wars in the name of peace, kind of as a justification. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to answer the question? Well, okay, we'll do two then. Can I go to Martin just there? He had his hand up a second.
Hi. So yes, my name's Martin Crook from the University of the West of England. My question is posed to Ghanea as well, as way of a challenge. So your thesis, your argument that religion is, you said at the beginning of your talk, the primary cause of political violence in the world. I want to ask you, do you not think that perhaps, in a sense, there is a kind of the danger of Eurocentrism or Euro-American centrism creeping in? For instance, in the last few decades, many of the most important conflicts have been waged in the name of the world order, have been waged in the name of civilization, and so on. Think of the wars of the wars of terror, waged in the name of fighting terrorism. Brown University in the United States estimated that nearly 5 million people have been killed by those wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So there's a quantitative challenge to your thesis, and I think qualitatively as well, are we not in danger of, you know, sort of confusing the rhetoric of wars with their actual real material causes? After all, Marx famously said that religion is the ideology through which people become conscious of their real material interests. To give you just one example, and I'll finish here, think of the war in Gaza. You know, you could argue, some may argue this is about religion and the claims that some religious fundamentalists have over that territory, but is it not really a settler colonial conflict fueled by Western imperialism, for instance? So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have one more. Just there.
Nina Bresiva from the EUI. Well, I guess I must say I'm not a global governance scholar, so I may have missed something. And I also will be the annoying one going to the critiques of international law and TWIL and so on. That was a bit set aside, I feel. Because I'm wondering to what extent the crisis of human rights and of international law, the seeds are not already within the system, and the power dynamics that are compensated in the values and in the system. And so to what extent can we answer this crisis by looking again at answer within the system with the same power dynamic and with the same actor? And I know you have mentioning multi-stakeholder, the fact that we have a new kind of dynamic in this global governance, but I was just wondering to what extent are those new actors or dynamic really questioning the power dynamics that already exist? Are those new actors actually not reflecting? Whose voice is counting into the debate? Because I kind of feel, yeah, we mentioned financial institutions, etc., but they do not change the power dynamic that already exists. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually going to amend this and add one more by me. Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear what you think about, I mean, you mentioned strengthening and deepening existing instruments, etc., to bring law up to date. One of the things I've been really interested in is, quite some time ago now, the Subcommission on the Protection of Minorities considered reinserting the cultural method into the Genocide Convention. Didn't happen, obviously. I'm wondering whether now's the time to revisit that idea, because I think cultural genocide is increasingly happening around the world. And the second thing related to that, which they also considered at the time, was inserting an ecocidal method into the Genocide Convention. But since then, there's now a global international campaign to make ecocide an international crime, amending the Rome Statute. And personally, I think that's a very interesting potential development that could address some significant gaps. So I'm wondering what you think about those two notions. Okay, so I have a question.
Thank you very much. I hope you address it in your panel today, and I'd be very interested in joining that. So I'm addressing the General Assembly and states, so you're absolutely right, actually, as a reading, in that it's quite defensive. It's trying to start where states are at, or those challenges I face in the mandates that, you know, religious pluralism, insinuating that it's dangerous and that religion can be dangerous unless the state controls it and manages it. So it is a defensive position. And I take up your challenge that we shouldn't only reclaim where things are at, but change the language. So it's an interesting one. I am quoting others when I use warriors for peace, etc. And I think if that's where people are at, then it's a interesting sort of, you start by reclaiming until you bring in new visions. But I think you make a good point. Martin, if you heard me say that religion is the primary cause of political violence, I didn't make a distinction between the quotation on the data about violence in the world and then moving on to the focus of my paper. So no, and the data doesn't suggest that. And it would be Eurocentric to say that. However, when you say that it's actually terrorism and it's actually extremism, unfortunately, most don't have the nuanced view that you do, and they see that extremism and terrorism also being, muddied by religion, if not caused by religion. So I think we need to clarify that. And indeed, some of the literature I was referring to very sweepingly talks exactly about, religion becomes the cleavage that then becomes an organizing principle, but it's not the primary or initial cause. So you're absolutely right to draw attention to it. And those material, when people talk about discrimination, persecution, and violence, then often it's much more complex than that. However, what my predecessor, Heiner Bielefeld, he said that we can't then say, if we take it so far as saying it has nothing to do with religion, then we are also doing a disservice to those who are either experiencing it through that lens, being targeted through that lens, or feeling it through that lens. But point well taken.
I'll just maybe speak to that last point about whether whose voice is being heard and whether these new actors are in fact reflecting the same dynamics. I think that is the crux of my thesis. The danger is that, unfortunately, some of those actors being private also curtails our ability to question them, hold them to account the way that we would hold states to account, even by naming and shaming. Because sometimes the heading, well, the Global Fund, you will know the Global Fund, but you won't really know unless you're doing research into it or kind of in the civil society questioning some of the policy choices. You wouldn't know which very powerful private actors are in that space and holding the the ropes and deciding on those choices. So indeed, it's very difficult, and that's why I think we do have to reimagine things through the lenses of human rights holders, but also the disprivileged, the dispossessed. So what are the claims of indigenous peoples, of minorities? So really shifting the lens onto those and seeing what those grievances are, what those claims are, because they are the ones that have experienced the dispossession, the violations more acutely. And so it is, I think, liaising with people's movements and their arguments that's what I think it will take to change what we view as a valuable multilateral system, and to really move beyond the state centricity that has caused, well, a lot of the tensions, but also that has kind of outsourced its obligations onto privatized actors. So I think you're absolutely right in that, and it's a difficult task that is ahead.
Something about genocide? Thank you for that question. I'm going to make a confession. I find genocide a very problematic crime. Why? Well, first of all, I want to make reference to the old discussion which Philip Sands had so beautifully described in one of his recent books, the discussion between Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin was the one essentially coining and inventing the crime which Churchill called the crime without a name. And so, yeah, do we need genocide if we have already the concept of crimes against humanity? That was the essential argument of Lauterpacht vis-a-vis Lemkin. And I think the jury is probably still out. Let's also face the following thing. What I find so remarkable is that the definition, the legal definition of genocide has become so, frozen in time. 1948, and literally the same definition in 1998 when the Rome Statute was adopted. Why were we not able to develop this further 50 years or 40 years later? And so I think one has to also go back and revisit the preparatory works. I know that in international treaty interpretation, we often tell our students, in international law, don't go to the preparatory works, they're not reliable. But it's important to know in what circumstances international norms have come about. And so especially that convention shows an enormous, tension and reluctance of states, and it all impacted the definition, the enforcement mechanisms, and so on. And I think the wider point may well be, and that's maybe a nice agenda for further human rights research, is go back to the travaux préparatoires of the various human rights instruments to see indeed what was at stake, how come certain things have been formulated as we are now simply applying and constructing, but sometimes we need to go back to those basics, and that may indeed teach us a lesson about how to probably update and deepen some of these instruments. But I mean, there are lots of other things about the Genocide Convention, the dolus specialis requirement, okay, fine, but it makes it nearly impossible to demonstrate that a genocide has taken place. And many states are able to actually hide behind that requirement. Another thing, and I remember my dear colleague and friend John Packer being scandalized because he once heard the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights saying, we cannot talk about the genocide in Myanmar because there has not been an international court condemning it. So the question is, can we even use the word genocide without a court decision? It's also still today a big discussion, but all of these things require some clear answers, and probably it will be high time to have some kind of big gathering in which we bring together and rediscuss the Genocide Convention, also probably to bring in other criteria for genocide, but also things such as ecocide and so on. The problem is we're never doing that. We're never calling new diplomatic conferences to rediscuss the existing old multilateral instruments because we're also afraid that the fundamental principles will be thrown overboard. Who dares to convene a conference to give an update to the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees? Nobody. Nobody. We know that, I mean, politicians would jump on it and would I mean, as they are already doing in their national policies, completely debilitate the whole system of the convention. So yes, I think that's a very serious challenge for us. International law and human rights lawyers is like, yeah, we have all those beautiful instruments, but to what extent are they just there on paper and are becoming increasingly neglected, discarded in practice? I mean, it's a real serious challenge. And it has to do, again, with the vitality and the dynamics of a legal system. So we really have to work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, one question there, and then we'll come down the front.
Buongiorno. I'm Salman Omar from Kurdistan region of Iraq. With my colleague, Dr. Zanubia, we will present a paper about the awareness of chemical security threat in Kurdistan region. So, we have heard from the statement from the Prof. Marco regarding to the weakness of the UN, let's say. Then the panelists, respected Nazila Ghanea and John, Prof, you speaking about the Yazidi genocide, perhaps like ISIL, Islamic State, they committed such crimes. Like after like 12 years, no action from the international community to recognize the genocide and make the accountability or bring justice to the Yazidi people. This is like as a community security level. Speaking about the Kurdish question in Middle East, like national security of the Kurd. So UN like have recognized the Rwanda, the Yugoslavia, maybe the rest, Kosovo. So with the Kurdish case, how would you evaluate the UN role, and what must step should be to secure the Kurdish community or the Yazidi genocide? And your perspective, maybe three of you, about the Yazidi genocide in general. Thanks.
Okay, there was one down the front here, thanks. Next one.
All right. Very extremely interesting, actually. I'm always asking about youth involvement in all of this. It's like there are two separate parties to this discussion, and again, we're in a room echo chambering once again. You have a few young people who are extremely interested in this line of work, and it's about work, always about finance, because you have to pick between being involved, perhaps never making enough of a living, or abandoning the movement and working. So I guess the question is, once again, with all the grassroots movements and the rights holders who are doing the work on the ground, and the separation between what we're seeing in this room and the discussions we're having and those folks, how do you connect these two? Because again, we're seeing movements, again, of people kind of distrusting the systems and doing their own thing. You see like what we saw with the campaign of Mamdani in New York, mostly social media driven. Yet we're having these conversations off of social media. We're not mainstreaming them so that people can actually understand what we're talking about. So I think it's fantastic work, and we should have these conversations, but how do you have them in a manner that the lay person can understand and pass on to their father at the dinner table or to someone on the bus?
Thanks. There was Malina over there.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Malena Raftopoulos, and I'm from Aalborg University in Denmark. And my question is actually for Jan. I wanted to just ask you about your remarks regarding regional integration and regional organizations, where you actually briefly mentioned Latin America. And the comment that you made about, Latin America hasn't been able to kind of get it together, more or less, to form a regional organization like the EU. I think, first of all, it's kind of important to point out that Latin America has a very different history and geography to the European continent. And I wanted to ask you if you think, first of all, why you feel that it's necessary when there are actually regional organizations within Latin America, like CELAC, and don't you think it could be slightly Eurocentric and colonial to think that this is a model that everybody has to follow. It's just a question. Yeah. and I mean, there's a lot of critique about regional organizations that they can erase the other, so to speak. So yeah, thank you very much.
I think we'll go to Corinne and then we'll finish.
Hello, thank you so much everyone for your interventions. I'm Corinne Lennox from Human Rights Consortium, University of London. I think my question could be answered by any of the panelists, but it's a question about what are the peaceful pathways to claim the right to self-determination for sub-state groups today? Because one has the sense that the multilateral order has sort of frozen this claim around the decolonization process. And even indigenous peoples have had to frame their claims around decolonization in order to make successful petitions for self-determination. And other ethnocultural sub-state groups have sort of been shut out of these claims. We heard from a colleague talking about the Kurds as one example. So do you see any spaces in the international system that can support these peaceful pathways so that groups don't have to resort to conflict to get attention, but can use multilateralism to make peaceful claims to self-determination if they're sub-state groups? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, folks. All right, who would like to go first? Go on, Ian. You go first.
Well, let me start with the question about Latin America, because I explicitly said that the EU is not a model. It could be an example, it could be a source of inspiration, but I'm the last to argue it should serve as a model for other continents. Of course, other continents, think of Africa, think of Latin America, they have totally different histories. But let's face it, I mean, the Latin Americans themselves complain about the total ineffectiveness of their regional systems. CELAC itself is powerless. The divisions are very huge, depending on whether you are at the right or the left side of politics. One colleague told me, and I found that a very interesting statement, that in fact the whole regional integration idea in Latin America is owned by the political left, but totally disowned by the political right. I wasn't aware of that. But if you think about that, that's of course a huge problem. Just imagine that in the European Union here, we would say, well, the whole European integration idea is an idea of the political left, and the right doesn't have anything to do with that. I mean, it would be a major disruptive thing. It would immediately delegitimize much of the process and so on. So I think that's probably one of the issues they have to come to terms with, is like, how do you ensure ownership on all the sides of the political spectrum to own and to support a process of regional integration. And again, I'm not prescribing anything, but let's face it, we too in Europe, if you start from the 1940s, you have seen how there was indeed a great diversity of initiatives. Some people have forgotten about that. We had the Western European Union, at the OEEC, we still have quite some diversity with the Council of Europe, and I'm not saying everything should be unified, but you need, I think, to federalize and to try to come to consistent and efficient structures. And that is something which I hope can happen over the long term in Latin America, maybe with the impending ratification of the EU-Mercosur agreement, something may happen there. But again, it's a maybe, we don't know. But I think it's in the interest of Latin America itself, because I'm the very first to argue that the Europeans have for far too long neglected Latin America. And the very fact that Ursula von der Leyen did not go to the summit was, I think, a very major blow to the dynamic of the summit. If you want to read more about it, in 2017 we made a study for the European Parliament mapping all the regional organizations in Latin America, and I still think that alone by mapping you see indeed how things are not working entirely well, and that there may be some, if you wish, merit in trying to bring it more together. There's maybe another thing that I would like to reply to still with regard to the question that our EUI colleague has raised, namely to what extent, if I understood your question correctly, to what extent are in fact the so-called new actors and non-state actors rather upholding the system of states or powerful states rather than taking issue with it. And I think it's a very important question to investigate. Look at financial institutions. And with financial institutions, we mean everything, from the IMF to the World Bank to the regional development banks, including in Europe and beyond. And I think it's a very valid point. We have to investigate thoroughly to what extent those development banks and financial institutions are not there to just push through the interests of some powerful states. Why is it that China felt the need to create the AIIB rather than trying to, have a stronger role in the Asian Development Bank, for instance? All of these questions are important questions because they touch upon raw power politics and so on, and I think we have to investigate them thoroughly. Similarly, when we talk about the private sector, I've done quite some research on, say, the emergence of private standards. Because, if you look at globalization, you should definitely not limit yourself to public international law anymore. There's a lot of regulation and norms out there which emanate from private sources. And so the big question then is, how legitimate are those private forms of regulation? To what extent can we even see some form of corporate capture there? To what extent private food safety standards, such as adopted by, Global Gap and other say, alliances of food producers and retailers, to what extent are they perpetuating a kind of Western supremacy vis-a-vis small farm holders in Africa and so on? Very important questions of legitimacy, representative accountability, and so on that arise for each of those non-state actors. So we should definitely not be naive about that. I think I will stop here.
So because not all questions fall within my purview of expertise, I'll just address maybe that question about, well, it started out with youth involvement, but how, as academics, as sort of policymakers, how do we, ensure these discussions are not staying in the ivory towers or kind of on the pages of journals that are read only by our peers, but to disseminate it a lot more widely and to have those conversations where it matters on sort of at the grassroots level with the people who are doing the hard work. And I think there is, for me, there's a double sword in the sense, of course, the timelines of us doing research and finding our findings are very much prolonged, whereas the global discussions on these are very fast moving. And a lot of us have not been trained, ill-equipped, maybe experiencing a generational divide in relation to use of social media and others. But I agree with your assessment that indeed a lot of these discussions may be had at sort of behind closed doors, not because we don't want to share our insights and we try to disseminate as widely as possible, but because also it requires, I think, different skill sets and really bringing together also a research environment that co-creates with grassroots activists and researchers, like community researchers who are doing research into human rights at the community level. So I think there's a change that needs to happen at a broader level, and I think maybe Corinne's question, I'm not an expert on this and wouldn't be able to chime in on that specific question, but I think there's a lot of exclusion of different peoples who may have different identities in terms of like group identity from high politics as opposed to low politics. So in the multilateral system, we do see representatives of sub-state groups and others in discussions around like sustainable development, environmental rights, but when there are softer discussions and when it comes to those higher politics discussions like self-determination, maybe they will be excluded because they don't have that like formal representation role, whereas in I think sustainable development and others through Agenda 21, etc., these groups were given a role in ECOSOC, and so there is a way to get yourself accredited and maybe have a bit of a space there, but not in discussions around peace and security. That might be more difficult. And I think that also has something to do with how we make global policy, and whether there's a question to be asked about inclusiveness at the broader level of multilateral, systems.
Corinne, you ask a critical question, because otherwise we are incentivizing violence and conflict, because that's the only way, not only in the impatient way or the urgent way, but it might actually be the way where you get most attention most quickly. So it's critical. Does the Minority Forum play some role there? Is the UN acting as it did, for example, in East Timor, where the UN team, locals had climbed into the UN compound. The UN staff was going to be evacuated, and they said, "We are not leaving. We refuse to be evacuated unless they join us." Have we seen that kind of bold, honest courage by actors since then? And what kind of self-determination are we talking about? In terms of communities that are targeted because of their religion or belief egregiously over many decades, for example, the case of Christians in Nigeria, is it helpful that it came into high politics a week ago, or is it really dangerous? It's not a very simple question. Your point about youth is critical. We're seeing, for example, the OSCE panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief now have a dedicated 2 panelists that must join for the panel to be complete. I think these are, it might seem as symbolic at the beginning, but I think it's really important. In a ministerial on freedom of religion or belief 2 years ago, it was preceded by a 24-hour online participation of youth around the world on the topic before the ministerial, and it was channeled into it, and there was special funding for youth participants. Less so, unfortunately, budgetary-wise, for the ministerial that starts in 2 days. Again in Prague, but we need to build it into systems. You're absolutely right. I don't have a simple answer about, having the engagement in social media. Sometimes it's constraints, sometimes it's know-how. I'm the wrong generation for sure. But when you have one UN human rights officer supporting a mandate, it's tough. It's tough to even meet the minimum objectives. Regarding the Yazidi genocide, absolutely, we should and do and should continue to hold our heads in shame in what happened. It was unfolding around our eyes. Heiner Bielefeld, I was with him when this was happening, and he was doing everything he can. This mandate has asked to visit Iraq. If you go on a country visit, then you can do a full country report and present to the United Nations. If you refuse the country visit, you can't report to the United Nations. So, you become kind of stymied in this way. The Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues was due to go to Iraq just, I think, in October, September, October, and because of insecurity, it was postponed. I have never got a response, but that would be a way of actually giving full response to it. Thankfully, there are many good reports and some attention to it. And I think your point about human rights, sorry, going back to the second question, it's also, has human rights become too regimented? Are we really more excited in social movements? And is it social movements that lend themselves to a more dynamic interplay with social media? It's worth thinking about.
Thank you, Nazila. Now we have about 5 minutes before our lunch break, so I was just going to abuse chair's privilege once more and just ask Nazila one question, because it's not often we have a special rapporteur in the room with us, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask. Can you, Nazila, tell us what you think are the core challenges in your mandate? And I'd also be interested even in the simple stuff like finance.
I mean, the report has gone from 10,700 words to 9,600 words, because apparently that saves budget. But, and 2 country visits per year to 1 country visit per year, and human rights, your support is down to 1. Hopefully, thankfully, I've had 1 stable person with a lot of experience who's excellent, but still it's 1 person, and there are all the bureaucracies. Even if you go on an academic visit, there has to be a note verbal communicated to that country that you're coming, even though you're not going to be reporting back to the UN. But that's too much doom and gloom, and not sort of worth focusing on too much, because you hold a workshop with actors and everybody shows up and shares generously. You go on a country visit and from months in advance, you know, we had 60 inputs within 4 weeks for the next thematic report. We have made it a priority to interact. You know, in law school, you learn about cross-fertilization and interaction between different human rights systems and fora. Then I realized that unless you make it happen, you know, the AU is not going to reach out to me. Neither is the Inter-American Commission or the Inter-American Court or the ASEAN. So I'm reaching out to them and saying that I'm sitting on 39 years of mandate practice. If it's ever useful to you, we're ready to summarize and share. You know, it's available to you. You can, there's a digest. You can search for it yourself, but I don't say that. I say we're just ready to share our experience in case it's helpful when it comes up before the African Court, the Inter-American Court, in case the ASEAN human rights system will consider having a declaration on this matter. And the response is always positive. The African Commission, they said, sure, let's talk. So you have to take the initiative, and those are the things that give you energy and thinking there is investment. Now, you present a report on freedom of religion or belief and people on the move at the General Assembly, you know, 2 weeks ago, and the states that engaged, either they're doing their normal diplomatic notes, they read out the same thing, and you wonder whether they even looked at the title of your reports, let alone the first page or reading the full report. But those that read it, they sort of said, so you say that if the root cause of respect for freedom of religion or belief is addressed, then people don't have to move. Can you talk about that? And I'm saying, true, like let's fully respect the human rights of everybody at the grassroots so that they don't have to be forced into exile and being internally displaced and asylum seekers and refugees or even migrant workers because they can earn an equal and fully fulfilling livelihood where they are. I don't disagree with that. In the meantime, we need resettlement options, right? So sometimes there is also a very selective engagement with it, but better than no engagement, right? But the energy from, and just, you know, it's a little bit sad actually, but when communities just want to be heard and they feel better just for having had an hour of, you listening to them and acknowledging them. Or I went to this conference early on and there was a lot of selfies being taken and I thought, oh my gosh, like Southeast Asia, they just love the selfie. And then suddenly I felt chill because I realized that they're taking the photo for their own safety because on their return, they're going to be interrogated. So there's also these moments where you think it's underfunded and increasingly underfunded, but it's still a magnificent opportunity that you need to maximize for the sake of those that still have some investment in it.
Okay. Okay, well, I think that's a very positive note to end on. So can I just ask you all to give one more round of applause to the whole panel, everyone's speakers. And we look forward to seeing you this afternoon.